Okay, well, morning everyone. Sorry about that delay at the start. Slightly reduced class today, but we're just going to be carrying on with our Venice picture. I'm just going to shunt that forward so. And like I said a moment ago, we're going to be doing a mix of some detailed things and adding in some final sort of extra color, just developing it. My picture looks fairly light at the minute compared to the photo, and I think yours might do as well. And of course, that's because we've been starting off by laying down our lighter colors so that we can then put our darker colors on afterwards. We're going to start with creating this jumble of people along the harbor front. We've got a few heads, but I think they're looking a bit lonely, so we can put some more in. And we can then add some figures around that. We can get the shapes of these buildings here that are in the shade on the right bank of the Grand Canal. We can do a bit more work on our water and some more details on our buildings in general, like the spire of San Bartolomeo over there. So I think we'll start off with some heads. I'm going to take a small brush. This is a size 4. Anything that sort of size will do is fine. We've got some reasonably sort of darker colored, darker toned heads here. So let's have some slightly lighter ones to keep them company. I'm going to wake up my small brush. And the great thing here is that, of course, if you look at that photograph, you can pick out individual heads, but when you look at it as a whole, they don't look like much more than blobs of color. And so we're going to take advantage of that with a brush that's wet but not dripping. I'm going to use this peach orange, I think it's called, in my palette. And I'm just going to get a fairly concentrated amount, but not too concentrated. Work it into the brush. And then I'm going to just drop some heads in. And the thing to notice is that heads will all be at roughly the same level if they're sitting down, but maybe we can have some standing ones as well. And they'll follow this sweep of perspective. And what I think is helpful is that we've established it with our little water line here and with our mooring posts as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and start popping in some heads. Maybe some of them will be obscured by, or partially obscured by things in the foreground. Maybe some of them will be turned away. We can drop in our heads to begin with.
What are these?
And then we can.
I haven't got any.
And then we can add hair to them if we want later.
Ones.
Bearing in mind, of course, perspective, that we're going to have them larger here, fading to smaller, to just tiny little dots really back here. Hello, good morning, Rashid.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hello. We are continuing a picture of the Rialto on the Grand Canal in Venice. So we're just looking at doing some detailing. I think the other sessions where we painted this are going to be uploaded. So if you'd like to try something like that in your own time, you're more than welcome. You can try doing something similar to ours if you'd like. Alternatively, if you just like to watch as we go through this, you're more than welcome.
I'll have to redo this because I've already done that. And you can see what I've done.
That's very lovely. Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Well, if you'd like to do something else or add some more detail or just watch as we go, that's fantastic. But thanks for showing that. That's wow, that's fantastic.
I think I can see your details are a little bit more vivid, so I'll do that again.
Okay, great. Well, like I said, it's up to you. You're very welcome to stay and paint along or just watch. What we're doing now at the minute is we were just having a chat in the last couple of sessions about some Singer Sargent watercolors of Venetian scenes. And what's great is that he takes these things, these great jumbles of people and objects, and is able to reduce them to a few artfully laced brushstrokes. And that's sort of what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be just putting in at the minute some heads. And of course, these heads are incredibly rough, but they don't need to be very detailed because we just need to give the impression of these crowds of people sat enjoying their Aperol spritzes or whatever on the side of the Grand Canal. And if anyone does hear a scratching and a meowing, as I was explaining to the others earlier, that's our cat Archibald trying and failing to come in and contribute to the art. And it's been a theme of this class that we use our photographs to help us, but we don't feel obliged to copy them entirely. So this bit that I'm painting now, we can see there are some large white umbrellas obscuring most of the scene on the waterfront, but I'm going to quietly ignore those. I think the red umbrellas look nicer. So I'm just going to have a crowd of people. If you would like to put some umbrellas up, then you're more than welcome. We've done that before. But I think I'm going to have some people out here enjoying the full force of the Venetian sun. Maybe one or two are standing up. Maybe I'll paint some sort of side-on faces. Of course, bearing in mind our perspective, all roughly following this perspective line, but getting smaller and smaller as they do. And maybe we'll have a sort of someone who's standing up over here as well. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to wait for those to dry. And now, still with my small brush in hand, I think what I'd like to do is do some work over on this side. So I think we'd like to start perhaps with the foundation that we've already got with the spire of San Bartolomeo over here. And we can see that we've got this, this beginnings, we've got this bright red around. But of course, the nice thing about this picture is that this multi-sided spire has one side that's in shade more than the other. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're just going to make up a darker red and then paint that on the left-hand side to get that shadow. And we're going to do the same thing with this oniony dome over here. So I think for that, I'm going to maybe get a larger brush just for the purpose of mixing my paints and just get the same red that I used, this bright one here, or red orange, as I think it's called in your palettes. And I'm just going to mix that with a little bit of black in my palette. once I've got one that's slightly darker, I think I'll just pause mixing and use that to get the midsection of this drum of the spire here, because we've got sort of two levels of shade there, haven't we? We've got that midsection that's a little darker, and then the section that's facing away from the sun that's much darker. So with my small brush in hand again, I'm just going to pick some of that up and just lay that on top. One of these days, that cat Archibald is going to learn how to open doors. He's going to figure out how door handles work, and then we'll all be in trouble. And then now maybe I'll just add a little bit more black in and paint the other parts, the other darker parts. I'm just drying my brush here on my kitchen roll before mixing, just to make sure I can control the amount of water that's getting involved. Oh, that's just up to you. If you think it's getting watery, that's something to do. And then again, with my small brush, I'm just going to apply this. Apply it first to there, and then secondly down the middle to the shaded half of the lower bit of our spire. And now I think I'm just going to take, again, my small brush, and I'm just going to start working on some of the detailing that we've got here, because at the minute we've got a white sort of band here, but we can see here there's this nice pediment and things on it. So I think I'd like to give a little bit of definition to that, and then maybe use some light gray just to pick out the shaded bits of that pediment that we've got in that midsection. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to start off with a small brush loaded with red orange, just to define this join here a bit more firmly. Wet on dry, fairly concentrated to get a nice, fairly crisp line. So I'm working quite a bit of paint into the bristles. And then maybe I'll just touch up that line just a little bit, just to make that a little sharper. Quite possibly you won't need to. I just think that's a little bit blurred on my picture, so it's something I'd like to emphasize. And then maybe I'll just tidy up this line here. And And again, with my darker color here, I think I might want to get those arches that have come in. So I'll just load that up. And again, we've seen before how arches and windows can be suggested just by really, really nice, simple downward strokes. And so I'm going to do something similar here, just to suggest, sorry, I'm just going to crane over. There we go, just to suggest those arches. And then to get the shading on those pediments on the white bit, again, just loading up a medium brush for the sake of color mixing. I think I'm just going to get some white into my palette and then mix that with some Battleship Grey, just so that we get a nice light grey to work with. So I'm going to want to start by just, I think, outlining the bit of the curved pediment that really sort of interrupts the red line of that band. So maybe I'll just load my brush up with this dark grey, with this light grey, sorry. And then just trace that round. Then maybe trace the outline of that part of it around. And then just get some shadow on the bottom there. Then I can do something similar here. I can really paint in the contours of that pediment. And then backwards and forwards, just fill that in. And maybe again, I can use that same dilute grey just to add some shading to the white band above. Just following on, taking my cue from the dark red above, just to give that shading onto the white bit. And then I'll just drop a bit more grey onto this darker section here, I think, just to get those tonal differences running through. Maybe I'll just smooth this in a bit as well. And then finally, I think I'll get some fairly thick, darker Battleship Grey just to pick out the edges of that pediment there that's in shadow. Fairly concentrated because we want to pick it out as darker. And then I think still with my small brush, I might just want to give a bit of shadow to this onion-shaped dome itself. And I'm going to use some black for that, just dropping in some color around the left-hand side and base, just to mimic the shadow that I've got there. And while I've got black on my brush, I think I might as well just do the cross, the finial there right at the top in very concentrated black, working right with the tip of the brush, just to get that nice clear cross against the sky. Topping out the Chiesa di San Bartolomeo. And maybe I'll just add a little bit of shading to that second little dome there. Just to emphasize the base. And then with dilute black, just echoing those arches, I think. And now if everyone's ready, we can do some slightly more broad brush stuff as we work on this part of the Grand Canal. What I'm interested in here is these houses that are in shade, because we've got the bits already that are picked out in highlight, but we're going to want to create a sort of darker, a shaded version of those. So I think I might want to begin with the color of the highlight and then just darken it a little bit. So for that, we're going to go back to our palette. I remember we created that cream color with a mixture of yellow ochre and white. And so maybe I'll base that shaded color in yellow ochre and then add maybe a touch of black. And then with a brush that maybe I've just dried a little bit, just to keep that moisture under control, I'm going to mix that up and apply it. And another thing to bear in mind, of course, is that this is a great opportunity to redefine the shape of the Rialto itself, because with this darker color, we can sort of paint over this outline and redefine it if we want to. So with a brush that, again, I'm just going to dry a bit on kitchen roll, small brush, size 4, just to keep that moisture down. I'm going to load my brush up. I'm just going to start painting the shaded side of these houses on this side of the Grand Canal. Pick out the pediment on top there. Maybe just redefine that nice and sharp. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have that color coming through just here, because we can see that there's bits of the houses behind visible through the arch, through the second of those great arches. So I'm just going to paint in that little segment there. And we can see, can't we, that great sort of froth of people along the bottom. And I think that looks rather nice. And I think I might like to just create something like that in a similar way to the way that we've created our heads on the left bank. So keeping with my small brush, my number 4, I think I'm going to take some nice, fairly bright bits of color, maybe some head color, maybe some brighter colors as well, just to give the impression of people and activity far away, far away, because heads at this distance are that size or smaller. So we want a fairly concentrated paint, far away, looking out off the Rialto. And they're sort of at this level, aren't they? And then they sort of follow the angle of the bridge itself downwards. And put them at fairly irregular intervals. but just enough to suggest there's a whole load of people having a nice time on the Rialto. Broadly at the same level because people are the same height, but maybe a couple slightly different here and there. Then maybe I'll just put some flashes of other colour. I think there are shops in these great arches on the Rialto. I think that's why it was originally built like that, so that traders and people could sell their stuff on the bridge. And I think there are still shops there now, so who knows, maybe some of these bright colours are fun Venetian souvenirs that you can buy on the Rialto. And then I'm just going to have a great time just, I think, adding in a couple more dots of fairly concentrated, fairly bright colour. Bearing in mind, of course, that these people are getting the sunlight hitting them square on. So all the bright colours of their clothes and souvenirs and whatnot is going to get really caught full on.
Felix, what color are you using?
I'm having fun using any color that I fancy, really. I've used this purple and this blue and leaf green so far, but I'm really just picking my colors to make sure that they're different from one another, but all bright, because like I say, we're painting people here who are in the full blast of the sunlight. So I'm just trying to get that suggestion of activity and fun on the Rialto with these bright colors, nicely sort of spaced out so that we don't get too much of one color in one place. They sort of look like fairy lights suspended like that, but fortunately we're going to give them a little banister and some more structure to the Rialto that should give them a nice place to sit. And now that this house behind has had a chance to dry, I think I'm just going to paint in this building behind it. And to do that, I think I might like to use my peach orange with maybe just a splash of black to get that shadow. Not forgetting, of course, that I need to fill in this bit of the house as well that is visible under the arch of the bridge. Again, just defining that arch nicely. And I don't know about anyone else, but I find that very satisfying because our Rialto for the last 2 weeks has just been like a sort of blur of cream color sitting there in the right-hand side of our picture. But as soon as we give it something to stand out in contrast with, it pops. It stops being a blur of color. It starts being a very nice bridge over the Grand Canal. So now with my peach orange and black, just going to get in that last bit of white, get another bit of dark color against which our shining white Rialto can pop. And maybe I'm also just going to fill in this house here, leaving a bit of space at the bottom for that hustle and bustle that we're going to paint in. Leaving a bit of space there as well for the red roof. I'm leaving quite a rough edge there just because we can add some sort of hustle and bustle there, paint over that with our dark colors. Once we've done that, I think these disembodied heads have been bodiless for long enough. So I think it might be time to add some bodies to those. And what I noticed looking at this is that, well, I've looked at the actual picture as well. Rashid, my printer, went on the blink and said there's no black ink in this, so it looks a little lighter than yours might do. But in any event, I looked at the picture and most of these people's bodies look fairly dark. They're fairly shadowy sort of colors. And so that's exactly what we're going to use to paint in the bodies of these people. What we're going to use is we're going to use colors from this end of our palette, from this darker range. I might use some of the midnight blues. I might use some of the dark browns. And one thing I'm going to bear in mind is that we want to leave a bit of space between our bodies, which I'm painting with a small brush, just so that we can emphasize the sort of tangle of forms of people crowding around. And the great thing here is that we really don't have to be too specific. there's not too much detail that's obviously visible in our photograph. So we shouldn't feel obliged to give too much detail here. We can have a think as well about whether maybe one person's body is slightly obscured by other people's bodies yet to be painted in. Standing people, maybe there's something in their way. It means we can't see all of them. We're just going to have fun chucking in these blobs of colour. Maybe we've got hints of outstretched arms. Maybe we've got the rough, rounded shape of shoulders. But we really don't need to worry too much about specifics. Maybe as well with our fairly concentrated dark colour, we can start adding in a sort of tangle of chair legs and human legs down the lower end here. Maybe that's something that I'll add a few in of now. Again, no real need to be too specific here. Maybe those are his legs. Maybe there's a leg coming off here. And I'm just going to have some fun using the different colours down this side of my palette. These dark browns and blues, just to get in these shadowed figures' bodies. Maybe I'll create little gaps for the odd chair back or bag. The beauty of it is that we don't need to be specific, we just need to give this impression of a crowd of people. Maybe if some areas end up looking a bit thin, we can add more. That's the great thing, is it's all very flexible. I'm adding some bodies here because I think we could have some more people over here. There are not yet any people to claim them, so they'll come a little bit later.
Maybe this person's sticking out a hand. Maybe he's a waiter presenting a bill to this fella here. Now maybe I'm going to add a sort of dark stone brown to this waterline. Just getting ready to add in the forests of table and chair legs and things that we have along the bottom half here. So I'm going to use one of these dark browns for that. I'm using this one here. Just blending into that dark blue. Maybe leaving a slight gap on the right-hand side of each of these little posts, just to give a little bit of an accent. And of course, making sure that my curb gets thinner as we get further away from the viewer. And now I think it might be nice to add a bit more detail to our water, because you might have seen when I was doing my water, you might have felt the same, that I was creating a lot of these white gaps, and it's a sort of watery texture, but it's still quite light. And the reason for that is that what I'd like to do now is to take our small brush, our number 4, and we're going to fill in those gaps, but we're going to leave some bits still white. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm just going to show you here with a brush without any paint on it, is I'm going to sort of paint in those bits, but I'm going to just go just shy of the top so that we've got these white crests, just to give the impression of little waves. Okay. So I'm going to take my small brush, and another thing to bear in mind is that we're going to want to have these larger crests and larger waves here, because as ever, stuff's larger when it's nearer the beholder. And as we do that, we're just going to begin here, filling in almost all of the water, maybe creating some thin lines of darker color, just to suggest ripples. And then they're going to become bigger as we come down the picture. So brush loaded with a fairly dilute blue. And we're just going to start painting that in. And don't worry if it seems a little dark on first flush, because we can pull that colour around.
Is that midnight blue you're using, Felix?
It is, but I think there are two midnight blues, which is a little frustrating, isn't it? So it's the one that's, I'm using the one that's closest to the sienna here.
Okay, thank you.
And as I say, it will look very dark when it's first put on the page, but do not worry, and just use your brush to pull that colour around, and we can end up with some very nice little lines suggesting ripples. Maybe leave in some slight white gaps there. And there you see, I'm just leaving these little gaps as I go, just to get that light colour suggesting little ripples in the water. Very, very slender, long lines at the furthest point, and they're going to get a little bit fatter. It lends itself quite nicely to being painted like this, water, because of course we want these fluid, rough shapes that we are so able to create with watercolour. I always say you can tell when something requires concentration because my head pops into the frame, so apologies for that. Using the very tip of the brush there, and these backwards and forwards strokes just grazing the paper to create these sort of ripple effects. And we're just going to keep tiny little bits of white in these horizontal slivers, just to suggest the light just catching a little bit of spray just here and there, very sparingly. Of course, as we get down the page, we can afford to have slightly larger strokes. So when we get around here, we can probably afford to change up our brush. But for the time being, just to get those very slender ripples, I'm using my number 4. Now here I'm starting to hit something interesting, which is the reflections of our buildings here. And here we're going to want to take our cue from the picture, which is of course our guide in the way that things look, even if we don't want to completely copy it. And we can see, can't we, that the building's reflection is broken up by all these choppy little bits of waves, because there are parts where a wave forms and the water's that position that the reflection of the building doesn't come through. So we're going to want to do something similar. We're going to want to slightly sort of chop up our reflection of our building with our blue currents and eddies, just like we've been doing so far on the broader bit of the canal itself. So I'm taking fairly dilute colour and I'm just broaching the reflection just like that, and then maybe adding in some of these sort of flat bottomed, slightly sharp currents, just sort of intersecting it. If there's a bit too much colour, you can see the colour sort of blooming. You can just get a dry brush or need a bit of kitchen roll and just lift some colour off. Here I'm just using a dry brush just to suck some excess colour off. There we go. Bless you.
Thank you.
And at this point, I think I might do what I mentioned earlier and switch to a slightly larger brush as these waves get a little bit bigger as they come towards us. So I'm now going to use my number 8 just to carry on what I was doing with my smaller brush, just for these bits that's closer to the viewer. I'm adding a bit more dark blue at the base here because, of course, we're wanting to look like we're roughly reflecting what's up above, and immediately up above here we've got all the dark blurs of bodies and legs and things. So I think it will work quite nicely if we have slightly darker bit of water immediately there, fading through to the paler colours of the building above, which are reflected here down below. What's nice is that the shape of the brush strokes quite naturally creates that sort of cresting wave sort of shape that we want to add to suggest moving water. I think I'm fairly happy with my water looking like that, but I can just wait a minute just so that we can all make sure we've got a nice water effect like that, and then we'll have a think about chucking some windows and arches on our Rialto and our houses here, which I think will have dried by now. I've just noticed the time, and I see yet again time has sped along. Teresa says we have until about 25 past, so we should be able to make up most of the time that was lost at the start of this session. But I think I'd like to take our time just defining our Rialto. So we're going to have a look here. We've got these balustrades here, these very slender sort of things. And then we've got this sort of, what are these called? Well, this sort of crockety stuff here, and then we've got the arch there has some shading. So I think I'd like to use some maybe slightly dilute battleship grey to do that. We've already got some made up in one of our palette spots. So maybe I'll just use a mid-sized brush just to chuck a little bit more battleship grey and white in, just so that I've got those ready to mix up and put onto my bridge. However hard I try, my white always ends up with the shadow of some other color in it. However hard I try to wash my brushes before I use it. So my white's got a very delicate pink hue to it at the minute, but with any luck that won't affect me too much. And so now with my light grey, I think I'm going to start by sort of underlining our happy crowds here with the top of that sort of balustrade. So I'm going to take my light grey up using a fairly dry brush because there's enough water in there already. And then making sure that the very tip of the brush has been loaded, turning it around as I load, I am going to paint in this sort of underline. And we see it's flat at the start, at the very top, but then it's sort of, it comes down, it follows this angle down, doesn't it? So I'm just going to do that here. And now I think, again, taking our cue from Singer Sargent, we're not going to try to paint the gaps between every single baluster on these rails, because if we did, then we'd go a bit mad, I think. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the bottom half of the different sections, leaving a little gap for those gaps in between. So there's two there, and then they carry on at fairly even spacings down the bridge. So I'm just going to do that. I don't know if you can see, but it sort of looks like a long dotted line. I'm reloading the tip of my brush fairly frequently as I go, just so that I've got enough of this to get an outline that we can see. Each of these segments roughly the same shape, preferably the same shape, but we don't need to worry too much if they're not exact. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at the shape that these balustrades make. And when viewed from afar, they're darker at the top, aren't they? There's more shadow at the top, and then they sort of flick down. So that's what I'm going to do as I sort of approximate them now. As I'm going to just lead from the top, just flicking down, and it can be fairly irregular, but as long as the brush point is flicking down towards the bottom like that. We're using the very tip. We can just give that rough suggestion. We don't need more than a suggestion because these people, they're just dibs of color. So it'd be very perverse to paint our banister with more detail than we do these human beings. Just chucking in some bits of dark to give that suggestion. I hope this comes through on the picture, just the suggestion of these balustrades. And now, maybe loading a bit more grey in because I seem to be running a little bit low. And muddling that in. I'm going to connect up those dots. Just like that. And then there's a bit of a gap, and then there's that sort of fancy, I have forgotten, trabeation, that's what it's called. That's what it's called. You can see here these little dibs, like little square dibs underneath the banister. And I think the idea that that's made in stone, but the idea is that it's meant to look like an imitation of the ends of wooden roof beams. That's why you see that in buildings. It's called trabeation. And we're just going to, first of all, do another little underline. And then we're going to trabeate that line with a couple of blobs in just a moment. So for the trabeation, we're just going to have some evenly spaced little roughly square blobs, just to suggest those little end bits of white stone. Just painting in what would be the shadow between them, following that line round, coming down, sort of like a set of teeth coming down off that line we've just painted. No, I don't like the phrase set of teeth. I apologize for saying that, because now I can just see a massive set of jaws here. No, no, no. And now we're going to add a little bit of a three-dimensional texture to the underside of the bridge, because we can see here, can't we, that we're not viewing the bridge straight on. We're viewing it, it's sort of tilted to one side from us, as it were. We've got this swoop of dark shadow just here. And so I think that's what I'd like to add now with our same light grey mix. Just going to take that paint up and then starting at the top, just swoosh round, making that bigger and bigger, just like that. Maybe rounding it off if necessary. And then just filling that in. Let's just kick that out a bit.
Which one you'll need to listen to.
And now I think we can just add those arches that we can see, and they're dark, aren't they? They're black, I think we can use for that. So brush in hand, small brush, fairly concentrated. I'm going to take my black up. I'm just going to, fairly concentrated, wet on dry, paint on those black arches, bearing in mind there's a sort of strut, I'll flip, horizontal strut cutting through each one. So I'm going to leave space for that.
It's the last comment. The last comment.
So just starting here, arch round, leaving that flat top there. And then after that gap, and then just connecting the people below, just like that. I'm going to do some more, just going down. And again, there are quite a few of them, but we don't have to have exactly the same number as long as they look similar. And as long as we've got that sort of, that shape, that idea, I think we'll be all right.